So very casual today, obviously, just letting it go. We're going to be doing something a little different. Usually I take a pattern and I make it more complicated. Today I'm going to try to take a pattern and actually make it simpler. And this is it. Okay, it is cute design. I like the shape of it. I like, it's got the little princess seams and everything like that. And I thought it was adorable. I got it home and I started looking at it. They make this out of, what they recommend is you sew in a woven, and in the back, you put it together with a separating zipper. Now, I am not a contortionist, and I do not have a lady's maid to get me dressed in the morning. So the idea of having a separating zipper behind my back and then having to pull that zipper up, it just doesn't make any sense to me. But I like the shape of the blouse. So what we're going to do is make it out of knit. And I have enough of this. This is the knit that I made that dress out of before. And I have enough of it to make one of these tops. So what I'm going to do is go through making the pattern. Certain things I'm going to be tweaking because I'm going from a woven with a zipper to a knit with no zipper. And they have this pattern being fully lined, I believe, and I am not lining. But it's just a way to make a pattern work for you. So anyhow, let's get started. Alrighty, so here are the pattern pieces. And with the exception of the back, I cut these out as is. Now you can see my little folds here. I did shorten them by doing the thing where you fold it on the lengthen and shorten line and bend it over. So I've shortened these 2 inches. The view that I'm doing, it's like this one, but I'm shortening it up because first of all, I didn't quite have enough fabric to go all the way down on all of them, but I'm just tucking it up just a little bit so it's beyond my waist, but it's not super long. So that should work. But anyway, the front piece in their version cuts on fold, so that's fine. I did that. Side front, side back, just the same. The one that I did differently is the center back piece, and whereas they had it cut just 2 individual pieces, I cut mine on a fold, but I also bumped it in. So here, if you can see, my fold line is in approximately, it depends on exactly where it is, but approximately 1/2 inch to 5/8 of an inch. That takes that extra seam allowance that they had here for the zipper out, and it should put the back fold where I need it to be, centering where they would have it. And you can see where they have these little dots. Let me move this up here. Their waistline dot here, and down here at their bottom dot, those are marking the center places. And so, that's about where I have the fold. Now this one here, it looks like it's in a little bit. That's because they kind of have their back cut at a slight curve, and I don't, obviously, but I don't think that's going to make any difference on this. And then I cut the sleeve piece. Pull you back up. And then I cut the sleeve piece. I'm doing sleeve view A, which is this little guy here. And we're going to just make it as is also. So the first piece we're working on is the front piece, and there are several match point circles and notches to clip, and like usual, I clip my notches in. McCall's Patterns notches are small, so I just clip them into the tip of their little triangle. And for the circles, what I do is I punch out the circle on the tissue paper. I have a little piece of scrap leather I put underneath it, and I have a little leather hole punch, and I just push down and it pops out that circle. And I am going to use we'll use this one. It's a heat erasable pen, fabric marking pen. I think the ink is about empty in this, but as soon as you hit it with the iron, the marks disappear. So that's how I'm going to mark this. There is 1 dot on here. Now the first thing that they're going to want us to do is reinforce this edge, stay stitch they ask for, down to this second notch, all the way up to the top. So I'm going to go ahead and stay stitch this time, you know, why not? And I'm going to be stay stitching it in at about 1/2 inch, so smaller than my actual 5/8 inch seam allowance, but not right at the edge. Okay, so you can kind of see here, there's my stay stitching, and all stay stitching does, it's a straight stitch, and it's going to keep that, it's usually on a curve, like a bias or some kind of other curve, and it's going to keep it from stretching out of shape while you're working with the pattern. So then you get the side front, piece number 2 in my case, and it just has notches, so I've gone ahead and clipped those notches. And I'm going to go ahead and pin these pieces to my front piece. Now on the pattern, they do have you notch the front piece in order to fit these curves. I am not going to notch it because since this is a knit, it should have absolutely no problem stretching into that princess curve shape. So what I have now is I have a side front piece, and I'm just going to pin it together starting at the bottom. Actually, I want that bottom to be nice. I want this notch here to match up with that notch. So I'm going to lay that flat, pin it on. There should be another notch right up here, which on this piece is up here. Pin that one on. And then at the very top here, it kind of juts out into a 90-degree angle. That matches up with the top of this piece. All right. So when you sew it at your 5/8 inch seam, it's going to even out right up here. So anyhow, let me show you what I mean as far as not needing to make those clips. This is on a woven fabric on a princess seam, 100% you would. But because this is a knit and these pieces are flexible, and that is the beautiful part of knits, I am just going to fit it down here. So I centered the center one first. And once I have that in place, then I can move these other two. Because if you just try to lay it flat on top of each other, it's not going to want to lay nicely for you. But you can see this stay stitch seam here is going to hold that side nice and firm, so that then we can just kind of mold the side piece side to it. All right, so let me put one more pin here in the middle of this long stretch here, and it's ready to sew. Now I am just using a regular straight stitch, and when I sew this, I am going to be putting a little bit of pressure on it. I am not going to be pulling it hard. I'm just going to be putting a little bit of pressure, like weighting my hand down, pretend this hand is the sewing machine, just so that as it pulls, it's under a slight amount of pressure so that it's not going to bunch up, and it will have the ability to give a little bit as we go. So I'll take you over to the sewing machine. So I am starting at the top of my seam and working down, and I do have a ballpoint needle in here because the ballpoint will help just the stitches be much better. It'll work. It works with knits because it can work between the yarns and not bust through them. But anyhow, if you can see what I'm doing with this hand here, instead of just pushing it up, I'm just kind of holding it lightly so that the feed dogs are actually pulling it out of my hand a little bit, okay? And it's just enough that there's a little bit of pressure in there. All right, so what I have here is when you sew it that way, the stitches are not going to feel 100% flat because you've kind of worked a little bit of give into it, but they are definitely going to hold. So I can open this piece up here, and that seam is going to be nice and flat. And nice, there's no puckers or anything there. So I'm going to go ahead and do the other side, and that will be it for our front piece. When we do the bottom hem and the sleeve attachment and everything, we'll just double check and make sure that our seam allowances are open at that point. And I think that's going to be fine as is. Now we're going to go to do the back. And the back is going to be a whole lot simpler since there is no zipper. So the first thing is just like the front. Clip all your notches, mark your little match point circles, and then what we're going to have to do is also do a stay stitch row on the back. And what do they say? They say down to the notch. So it's going to be the same thing at about 1/2 inch or so, 3/8 if there's a mark for that on your machine. Come all the way down to this set of double notches when you're doing your stay stitch. Now I want to point out one thing. When you're stay stitching, you want to sew it the opposite of when you're seaming. When you're stay stitching, you do not want to work any stretch into this stitch, so you do not want to pull it as you sew. If anything, you want to just kind of encourage it to go through as fast as possible, because the whole point of this is to keep it from stretching. So if you work stretch into it, it defeats the purpose. So I just thought I would mention that. So anyhow, we have the side, or the back is stay stitched. And what I'm going to do now is go ahead and clip all my notches and pin this side to my back piece. So again, I'm starting by matching up my bottom, match up my top with the little edge up here. And then there's the double notches that we had where our stay stitching ended. So I'm going to find those double notches on my side bodice piece right here and match those up. And then the rest is just working its way in. The bottom part is pretty much a straight seam, so there's not a lot of easing there. This one up here where you did the stay stitching, what I would do is just start in the middle, because like I said, with all princess seams, one side is going to, when you just lay them flat, one side's going to stick out farther than the other. Okay, I like to find the midpoint between my two notch points. Find that midpoint and bring it down and put it at the same edge as the bottom piece. And then I can just do one right above it and one right below it. That usually works really well. Now, if while you're sewing it seems like you need to adjust something, do it then, you know, but this is a very good place to start. And that stay stitch that we did here is going to keep the shape that we want. If you don't stay stitch it, there's a tendency for things to get stretched out of shape. With my front together, my back together, my next step is I'm going to sew my shoulder seams. Now, then, since if these were sleeveless and there was going to be no weight on it, I would not worry about reinforcing it. Because there's going to be a sleeve on here, and there's a chance that the weight of that sleeve could make this want to stretch in time, I'm going to reinforce it as I sew. And what I'm going to be using is just some clear elastic. And what I do is I don't stretch it as I sew. I just lay it flat. And as I sew my regular stitch, I'm going to be sewing over that elastic. And this stuff is great because it's going to want to come back to its original size. So if it does get stretched out of shape, it'll come back real quick. If you don't have this, use a stay tape, reinforce it in some other way, but just do something so that you make sure that your shoulders are not going to stretch out of shape. Okay, so we're going to put the top aside and just work on sleeves for a while. So there's 3 dots you need to mark that are indicating where the gathering works in between there. And you have notches, and also above this center dot, that is where your shoulder seam will be. So the next thing to do is to gather up here between these dots, and there's a few different ways you can do it. I'm just going to do old school way of running 2 rows of gathering basting length stitches there, And like always, I set a stronger thread in my bobbin because I'm going to be pulling those threads. And that is just because this is, even though it's a knit, it's a slightly thicker knit. And the last thing I want is for one of those threads to break. Alrighty, so I'm just pinning one of my labels to the back of my blouse so that way I know at a glance what is the front and what is the back. So the shoulder seam, I'm going to, the shoulder seam, I'm going to, just kind of finger press that seam allowance open. And the same with these princess seams as I get to them. So what I'm going to be doing is matching up my little sleeve here, making sure that I have the back to the back and the front to the front. The back always has more notches than the front. So the one with 2 notches, is your back. So I'm going to go ahead and match up. Very first thing is my notches, my edges, my dots, all the way around, and pin those on. Alright, so I have my gathers. See, I need to pull this a little bit more. Done up here along the top between all the dots. And yes, I did do 2 rows. 2 rows help those gathers lay flatter. It's just easier that way for me. And yes, I do tend to overpin, but I wanted to make sure I pinned my seam allowances open at each one because it's easier for me to pull out an extra pin than to have to go back and pick open a seam and flip something over and restitch it. So I do tend to overpin, but in the long run it seems to save me time. So I'm going to go ahead and sew this seam all the way around, being careful that my gathers continue to lie nice and flat, and do this on both shoulders and side seams. I'm going to be using this bias tape to face the neckline instead of a facing. And I'm showing you that when you have a flat bias tape, one side is folded in, the other side is folded in. What I'm doing is I am opening up one side and pressing the fold edge of the other to it, as you can see, and then folding it back under. And I am then pressing it, and that's going to give me the folded edge. The reason that I'm doing it this way is because it's going to make one side of the fold slightly wider than the other side of the fold. And I'm doing it that way on purpose. So when I fold this, you can see one side is wider than the other side. And that's helpful because when you're putting it on the edge of something, you can put the wider edge on the bottom, the shorter edge on the top, and make sure that the needle will catch the bottom edge, which you can't see. So I'm going to go ahead and finish folding this, and then we're going to start working on the neckline. So what I'm doing is I opened it up and I am pinning the one of the folded edges to be equal with the raw edge of my neckline. And I'm just carefully going an inch and a half or so, putting a pin, and that way I can very slightly and carefully work in the curve of the neckline all the way around. Alright, so just a quick recap, because I just realized my volume was turned down on all the other video for a while. When I first started sewing around, I folded it under, about 1/4 of an inch or so that when I came back around and I put my final piece on top to overlap it, I could just put it inside. And that way, from the outside, it's going to have that nice finished edge there. So what I need to do right now is come back in, and this is what it basically looks like right now. I have a 2-inch wide strip. I have it folded in about 1/2 inch on each side, and it's sewed in the middle. That's what we've got. Now I'm going to take some of the bulk out of the inside here, because what I'm going to want to do is turn this in and stitch it here. But I want to take some of that bulk out, so I'm going to trim it down like this. about 1/4 inch from the stitching line, and I'm taking off just a little bit of the fabric and a strip of the bias tape, and I'm going to do that all the way around. Okay, so now that I have it trimmed, what I'm doing is just kind of folding that edge over my raw edge, this one that's left here, and then flipping the whole thing down. And I want to secure it so that the edge of the fabric is pulling in. And because of the way we sewed it, it's going to naturally want to give us a little more of a roll that way. So actually I need to be putting my pins this way. It's better if you put your pins so that the heads are in the middle. It's easier to pull. These are backwards, ignore those. But as you're going around and pinning it, just kind of work that shape back into it. Okay, so I want to talk about a couple things here. First of all, when I come to sew it, I am going to sew the back. I'm going to start at the shoulder seam here, go from back to the other shoulder seam, and then I'm going to leave a little space, and then still in this seam allowance, so like right in the very center, I'll just leave a little space, and then do the front all the way around to the front. And the reason I'm going to do this is because I did not want to do a facing with this. I don't like the feel of a big bulky facing or a big long facing on what is basically a t-shirt type of a blouse. The back should be fine. The back with the stitching and everything, there's not a whole lot of curve to it. So with the bias tape itself, it should be fine. Now, with the front, the knits are notorious for wanting to, after you sew it, to kind of do this kind of thing where it pooches out, okay? The reason I'm leaving these open at the top is because I'm going to be doing a little trick with my same invisible elastic that I used up on the shoulders. Now, you don't need this particular elastic. You can use elastic cording, you can use 1/8 inch elastic, just something really small. And basically what I'm going to do is from shoulder seam to shoulder seam at the front, I'm going to cut a piece of elastic longer than what I want. I don't want it to be just barely the size. I want it to be longer so I have some play. And basically I thread it onto a needle and tape it on the needle so I can pull it all the way through. And then when I'm done sewing, like say this is my seam, okay, this is my bias tape that I'm sewing on there. Let's say, I'm going to stretch it out of shape just to make it really obvious here. Let's say that that's what my neckline looks like. And I'm freaking out about that because that's not what I want. So I thread my elastic through. I've got this little pin holding it in place up there. And then I can just pull this side just enough until it's all going to lay flat. Okay? So I don't want to pull it until it's puckering. I just want to pull it until it's going to lay nice and flat. And this is basically acting like a casing, and it's plenty wide for a very narrow piece of elastic. All right? So then once I have it the size that I want, pretend this is one shoulder seam and this is the other one. Then I'll be able to go ahead and stitch it, anchor it in place, and my neckline will always want to snap back to this position where it's not going to gape open like that. Okay, so that is our plan. That's why I'm doing what I'm doing. Now the pattern itself did come with facing pieces. Like I said, I just chose not to do it. You can do however you want. And another point is this is just one way of dealing with a knit neckline. There are so many ways of dealing with it. But this is just one. And if you did want to use the facings, that's fine. Go ahead and use your knit fabric on here. There is a inner facing that works better with knit. I'm going to go grab it right now. This is just an example. There's different kinds. But basically, this is a fusible inner facing. But instead of being on that Pellon stuff, it's actually on a tricot stretchable knit type of a base, if you can see. So I would suggest if you are going to be using their facing pieces and you are using a knit fabric, try to use a interfacing that's made for knits. It'll just work out better. And just do the standard interface or standard facing stuff. I would just make sure I understitch it, you know, so that you have a nicer neckline edge. But this is what we're going to be doing. So go ahead and stitch here. Now, one other thing I wanted to show you on this, because this is just a regular straight stitch and it works just fine. It's really does. I am actually going to do something a little bit different for this here and for hemming my sleeves. And that is I'm going to be using a double needle. So if you've never seen them, these are double needles. And you basically have one shank that's going to fit into your machine. And then you have two needles that come out. And when you get double needles, there will be different sizes. One size will be the actual size of the needles, and then the other side will be the number of millimeters between the needles. And this is a variety pack, and you can see that the needles are actually, we have different spacings and things and sizes going on. And this is just a universal needle. It's not a ballpoint, so it should work, hopefully. And then you just have to play with your individual machine to see the best way to thread it. Now I'm going to show you on mine. Mine is a older machine. Hang on a second. Trying to find a place where I can see what I'm doing here. So what I have found is the best thing to do is I take my bobbin thread that's matching my cone thread and from down below, and I put it up here, and then I just put a different bobbin in the bottom. That way I have matching threads on top, and I actually put a yellow one in the bottom. So, but that's not going to matter too much. I just want to make sure my top two are matching. And I put them together, and I run them together through my whole little tension mechanism. And again, you know, you do you. Now, my machine actually in the little pickup arm here has two different holes. And so I'm going to put one thread in each hole. Then again, together, bringing them down through, and every machine is different. So I have stitched it on with my double needle, and it honestly doesn't look that bad. It doesn't look like it's going to really have a gapey kind of a problem. But we're going to do this anyway because we just want to make darn sure it doesn't, you know. So what I'm going to do is I've got a big-eyed yarn needle, let's see, like this. And I'm going to get some of my elastic, and again, like I said, just use whatever really narrow stuff you have, whether if it's cording or 1/8 inch elastic, or if you have this clear stuff, it works really well. But I'm going to make sure that I have plenty. I don't want to cut myself short. So that's what it needs just to go around it. I'm going to give myself like an extra 4 inches. And what I'm going to do is get a little piece of tape, thread this through my needle, and put a little piece of tape here to tape it together so it doesn't want to come loose, just because. And I'm using my needle instead of my bodkin because this is a pretty narrow casing, and I don't want to lose anything here. So I'm going to go ahead and feed it through, and I'll be right back. So I have one side through, and I'm just straight pinning it to the edge there so it doesn't want to pop back through. And work all this fullness back out and lay it back flat again. So at this point it's pulled a little too tight up here, so I'm just going to let some of that out, work it down and around. Okay, so now I think we're back to where we should be. So I have my little edge poking out because I cut it way too long, remember? And I just want to make sure, like, let's pull it out so we can see what it would look like if it was pooching out, all right? So I'm going to pull this little elastic here and let it settle in. You know what? I'm going to give it one more little tug. Work that around. And I'm at the verge where if I pull it any tighter, it's going to want to pucker. At this amount, it's almost there, but I can still make it look flat. And I think that's where I want it. I don't want this neckline to be stretching out. So I'm going to go ahead and pin my elastic here also for right now. Does not want the pin to go through. Okay, so from the outside, what I'm going to do is the sleeve seam allowance with all the gathers, that goes towards the band, all right? And this up here is obviously on the inside, so I'm going to do a stitch in the ditch deal all the way, a stitch in the ditch all the way across. And what that does is it catches the seam allowance here so that this doesn't want to pull down. And I've actually already done that part. But by doing it up here, it's going to catch that elastic so the elastic doesn't want to fly back through. Just make sure when you pin your elastic that you're pinning it far enough back. I was thinking for new people out there, if you don't know what stitch in the ditch is, what it is you're sewing from the right side. And as you're sewing, you're trying to get your needle to run straight in the middle of that seam, okay? Sometimes, if you're able to, you can try to pull the fabric apart very slightly, and it'll help you. The best thing to do is to use a thread that's going to match your fabric as close as possible, because if it comes out of the ditch, you'll be able to see it. Now, on something like this, where what exactly will be close as possible? I had picked a green color, but unfortunately at the top of my shoulders it was more like this type, and it's the lighter colored, so my green thread shows. But you know what? It's not the end of the world. It's going to do what it's supposed to do, and I'm considering this neckline part done. So here's my neckline, and I'm feeling pretty confident that this neckline isn't going to gape and that it's not going to sag. So the next thing I need to do is the sleeves. Now we have this all together as one big piece, and one of the benefits of that is that you can just sew up the side and the side seam all at once. All right, I want to show you a few things right now. This is the inside. This is what the inside of the double needle looks like. I don't know if you can see, there's a yellow thread that's my bobbin, and it kind of is a little bit of a zigzag. So that's what gives it the flex that a double needle does. Now, what we have right now is let me stretch her back some so we can see. I just have it on here pinned up the side because my next step is going to be to sew up these side seams, making sure my seam allowances are pressed towards the bodice. But I wanted to show you this. See how this just wants to wrap up and hold and everything? That's why we trim and clip and everything seams. Now, I would rather not clip into this because I just don't want to have any chance of this seam here coming loose. So what I did is with pinking shears, I've trimmed it about 1/4 inch all the way up to the point where the gathers start. At that point, it's a flat seam, so you don't need to worry about it. So by doing that, this harsh flip that you have on this side that's going to misshape the seam, it's not going to be there, and it will be a lot easier. Now, there's one more thing. See, I push her back even more. You can see that this blouse, it's going to be nice and loose here and everything, and that's what I want. I don't want this to be skin tight. I want it to be loose. If you wanted it to be tighter, now is the time to take it in. You know, at this point you can adjust your side seams, adjust these front seams and everything, and you could do that. I just don't want to. I want it to be loose and comfortable. So at this point what I'm going to be doing is pink this side, the same as that, and sew these side seams. Okay, just a regular side seam. Now one other thing is I'm not using a serger for this, as you can see. Two reasons. One, I wanted to show that you don't need a serger to sew on knits successfully. You know, you just don't. But also, sometimes when you're serging, like say I was going to come around and serge this seam, all right? Sometimes by doing that, it actually makes it a little bit stiffer, so on the right side you see that serging underneath. And I just didn't want to deal with it. Okay, so ready to hem some sleeves here. Now I wanted to show you this pattern, the sleeve. It's designed for a 1-inch hem. I don't want to do a 1-inch hem because I want to be able to press my hem up with my Stitch Witchery stuff, which is 1/2 inch wide. So what I'm going to do is actually, before I get started, I'm going to trim 1/2 inch off the edge of my sleeves. So now my hem is 1/2 inch, which fits perfectly. So I'm going to need to do a little bit of pressing here. With my seam allowance open, I can then fold it over to a 1/2 inch hem, like this, and I'm just going to press that so I can get a nice little crease to work with. And okay, so I have my fold here, and I can just lift it up a little bit and set my Stitch Witchery in there up against that fold and repress it down. And that is going to hold that up really nice and really smooth so that when I come to stitch my hem, I'll get a beautiful hem. So I'm going to go ahead and do the other side. Lay it nice and flat. Rip off a piece of this that's approximately the right size. Open up my flap and lay it in there next to the crease. Okay, press it. And again, I have it. So now this sleeve is, it's like glued on. The Stitch Witchery works like a glue to glue it together. Instead of pins, you can use this. So I'm going to go ahead and do the other sleeve, and I'm going to be doing the bottom exactly the same way, except of course I'm not going to have to trim anything off the bottom, but I am going to do the same 1/2 inch-ish hem with my Stitch Witchery on the bottom. So with this folded down and fused together with the Stitch Witchery, it's going to hold it nice and firm, so I don't have to worry about what's going on back here. So I'm sewing it. Again, I've loaded my double needle in here, and I'm working on it from the right side. I can kind of feel where the edge is, but I put my little metallic or my little magnetic seam guide on here at about 1/2 inch, and that way I can stay pretty consistent all the way around. So let's just get going. Oh, one thing is you never want to do a zigzag with a double needle because it might overshoot the size of the hole in here or your presser foot and crash your needles, and that would be bad. So you can see this is what my hem is going to look like. And I think that's nice. Now, if you don't have a double needle or you don't want to use one, you just want to use a regular straight stitch with a single needle, that will work 100% too. Guarantee. But you can see on the back here, there's a little bit of a zigzagginess. That's what the double needle does. So it builds a little bit of stretch that way. And that's one of the benefits of using them. Came inside because it was a little windy out there, as you can see. So I think, let me write this down some. Okay. So I think in general it went really well. If I'm going to do it again, and you know, it's a possibility, it's very comfortable, I would go down a size. There's a lot of extra ease in here. And I think that if you're doing it out of a woven, it might make sense to leave it, but in a knit, it's not going to. I think that actually going down a size, or maybe even two, at least one, would be a good idea. So the things that were different in this top were introduction to a double needle. If you've never used one before, the hardest part for me with using a double needle is getting the tension right, because you're feeding it 2 threads through your tension discs and everything, and I just have to basically agree to not be perfect when I use a double needle, because getting that bottom tension exactly right with both threads is a little bit difficult. But no one really sits there and analyzes the bottom side of your garment, so at least they shouldn't, I guess. And let's see. Oh, another thing was using the elastic as a way to take any gapiness out of your neckline. Just very thin elastic, threading it through, that's helpful, and you can use that for a lot of different things. And I only did the front. If you tried on yours and you were trying to do, and you saw that you needed it in the back, well, do it in the back too, you know, no harm in that. But a big part of it was just showing that if you take a pattern that is not made for stretch knits, it doesn't mean you can't make it in a stretch knit, especially if it's fitted. And that's what drew me to this, is that it looked like it was supposed to be a fitted top. And so usually knits, because they have that stretch in them, you can pull them on and off instead of having to have some kind of a closure. Sorry, my dog is coughing in the other room for some reason. Anyhow, by using the knit instead of using a separating zipper, and whose idea was it to approve a pattern with a back separating zipper in a top? I just don't know of anybody who would really enjoy that kind of a thing. So anyhow, this is a good alternative to it. I think it makes a nice little top. I shortened it by 2 inches, and you saw where it fell on me. So, you know, if you wanted to shorten yours to the same amount, it was 2 inches. Anyhow, hope you liked it. It's a quick one, but you know, sometimes those are good. Talk to you later. Bye-bye.